Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and for this wonderful event, and for finding time and devoting this session to Georgia's fight and plight, because Georgians here also, in these 3 days, I've heard a couple of times how prone to exaggeration and drama, and how noisy we are. And we are indeed prone to exaggeration, but right now, unfortunately, I wish we were exaggerating when we were saying that Georgia is facing a truly existential moment. Either the country retains its statehood, sovereignty, independence, and freedom, and possibility of coexistence of citizens in all their diversity, or it succumbs to very vicious, very dark influence, ideological influence as well, mainly coming from the Russian empire or neo-empire, or however we would like to describe it. So at this moment, it's important to talk about our plight, which we believe, and I personally believe, Georgia's situation and the predicament Georgia is finding itself in is definitely part of global shifts. And we are indeed living in an era of global shifts, of some call it the breakdown of the post-World War moral order or consensus, or the final days of the liberal democracy. Again, there are many terms being circulated, but something is changing. We all feel that it is changing, and Georgia might be a small, some would call it peripheral, part of this change, but it is definitely whatever's happening in Georgia is happening on a regional as well as on a global scale. So I thought it would be appropriate to just give my perspective of what's happening on a global perspective, and why we think that to explain why Georgia is part of these global universal shifts in ideology or in the moral order as we knew it in the last decades, and it's some kind of a zeitgeist. And again, there are many names that people circulate and call this zeitgeist. One of the leading and very interesting political analysts of our era, Ivan Krastev, suggests that we're living in an age of populism, the rise of right-wing populism, to be more precise. And I believe it is imperative to say a few words about the concept itself, what is populism, because it is also an elusive and sometimes even abused or overused term. Populism, as we know, it's not an ideology in itself, it's more a style of politics. Here I will be also, it's of course not my definition, and I'm sure all of us, we know, I won't be saying anything new. This is Jan Werner Müller and his wonderful small book on the nature of populism, and I think it really explains, again, very succinctly what is happening and our reality. Because in our day and age, such very diverse politicians from, I don't know, Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen and Bernie Sanders, Syriza in Greece, left-wing, right-wing, Hugo Chavez, Morales, they've all been named populists somehow. And it is true that there are politicians who want to appeal to the common sort of people and be sensitive to their thinking, to their problems, speak on behalf of the people, but not all of them, obviously, are populists. Populism is a very specific term. Some even would conflate populism with democracy, because democracy is people's voice, people's representation in politics. So if a politician is voicing the people's sensitivities and speaking on behalf of people, then it is, of course, the sort of distilled form of democratic rule. But again, populism is not democracy, and populism is not democratic. It is anti-democratic. It is, of course, anti-elitist. But what is the distinguishing factor is that it is essentially anti-pluralist. So people are distinguished by the claim that the politician speaks on behalf of people and everybody else who is not thought to be part of this group of the people, they do not count, they do not exist. So the essential condition of liberal democracy, of social democracy, the recognition, parties, multi-party system, different ideas, different worldviews coexisting in the same space, that does not exist in the populist sort of mode of policy making or politics in general. There is a quote by Donald Trump that went largely unnoticed. He was campaigning for the first term, and I'm quoting, "The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything." So this is populism in its essence. The other people, they don't mean anything. We are the people. I am speaking on behalf of true people. So it's very simple. Democracy is complex. Populism is simple. And of course, it's always a fantasy to speak about one homogeneous group of the people. Name of Jürgen Habermas was brought up several times during our discussions here. And Habermas famously even suggests that there is no such thing as the people as a term or a concept. It should always be used in plural as peoples. Then there is another story. When populists make it to the government, they almost always, of course, end up hijacking the state apparatus. They don't care for checks and balances. They're corrupt governments most of the time, clientelism and so on. But there is another important element that we have to consider when we talk about populism, and right-wing populism in particular. Nowadays, there is another analyst who came up with this very humorous but very bitter definition of populism. His name is Benjamin Ariditi, and he says that populism sometimes resembles sort of a drunken guest on a party table. So he misbehaves, he doesn't respect table manners, he might flirt with the host's wife, or basically he's rude, but sometimes he might say truthful things about the host, or the host being greedy, or the host being nasty. So there is, of course, some basis why populism sometimes takes charge and why it becomes a dominant mode of politics making or policy making. And the most complex and open question that we all grapple with, and I'm not going to touch today, and this is not the right time and space, but we all have to think about, and we all do think about, is, of course, what particular historical circumstances have facilitated this rise of right-wing populism that we're witnessing nowadays across the globe. How is it possible that oligarchs and kleptocrats are on the rise in so many countries, in so many continents, and why is it that we're once again witnessing people who have been left behind by forces of capitalism, the poor, the working classes, being sort of lured in the direction of the right-wing, nativist, xenophobic, ethno-nationalist, isolationist, anti-migrant, anti-women, anti-gender politics, and not wages, social justice. The left is non-existent, whereas the right-wing forces are rising. So we can't go there into trying to explain the reasons for where we are right now, but we can state the fact, as many analysts again today would state, Enzo Traverso among them, who is a wonderful living historian, and I definitely would recommend, if you haven't read already, his books on left-wing melancholia, as well as the new faces of fascism, that we're living in times which are distinguished by this very explosive, vicious, toxic cocktail of identitarianism, Islamophobia, and very regressive form of, we could even say, anti-globalization. The Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Italy, Poland, Hungary, these forces with varying intensity and varying degree of representation, but they are gaining force and they are becoming popular. I'm not even mentioning here Latin America and India and other countries. And then there is, of course, Russia with its particular form of this toxic nationalism. So, and the rise and comeback of Donald Trump, with its exclusively and very open rhetoric of making America great again, anti-migrant, nationalists. So this has become a global phenomenon. So comparisons with the interwar years, therefore, are inevitable. With the 1930s, some people say we live in neo-fascism, or some would even say, and I subscribe to this idea, that the term populism even is not enough anymore. This is right-wing populism is, of course, big part of it, but we are probably now living in an era of neo-fascism or post-fascism. This is not the exact repeat of 1930s, because totalitarian system is hopefully is not going to repeat, but this is sort of more cunning, more adaptable form of neo-fascism or post-fascism, which is taking hold. And I always go back to some of my idols, Pier Paolo Pasolini being one of them, who we mentioned yesterday when we were discussing Medea. He depicted this anthropological model of neoliberal capitalism as a new fascism already in 1974. And back then he was comparing it with the regime of the Mussolini, and he was saying that Mussolini's regime was, in comparison, very sort of archaic and localized episode in Italian history, whereas the neoliberalism is going to unleash something much wider and much more vicious and poisonous. And same thing we can quote, I don't even remember, Theodor Adorno, who was writing in the end of 1950s, I think it was, that the survival of National Socialism within democracy was potentially more dangerous than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy. So, but of course then the 1990s happened. Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, and everybody was celebrating the irreversible, at the time it seemed so, victory of liberalism and liberal democracy, and that was, in Fukuyama's view, he's often misquoted, of course, as we know. What he was saying is that there is no new formation will be born, and this will be the end of history in terms of, paradigmatic development of ideologies and philosophies. But another name that I want to mention here also, and I keep mentioning whenever I get a chance to speak about these issues publicly amongst colleagues who I know are interested in these issues, is Mark Mazauer. Maybe you know this historian, who around the same time when Fukuyama was writing The End of History, he wrote a book about 20th century Europe and called it Dark Continent, in which, and this is the 1990s, in which he explains very masterfully how, yes, at the end of democracy, end of the Cold War, democracy indeed won, and therefore people assumed that democracy was deeply rooted in European soil and it was something inevitable and fated, and of course, sort of democracy and Europe are, or what the West are indivisible. But he explains very well how fascism or fascist paradigms were fit into the mainstream of not only Germany, Italy, and Spain, but in European history and in general. And again, we cannot forget, so on the one hand, there is this ingrained fascism which has not arguably disappeared, which maybe lay dormant for some time, but now it regained new forms of nativism and xenophobia in the West. But then we have this resurgent Russia, which actively works with the West to destroy the West by supporting far right in Europe, by supporting all kinds of splintering forces, being Brexit or all kinds of separatism, cyber wars it's waging, propaganda campaigns it's waging, and of course by invading Ukraine, it started exporting its governance models and its ideological phantoms towards the West. And Timothy Snyder's book, all his books are wonderful, of course, and most of us have read all of them. I certainly try to follow all his major publications. But he has one book which I find particularly prophetic. He wrote it in 2016, it was published, so the full-scale invasion of Ukraine hasn't happened yet. It's just, Crimea is happening. This book is called The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, in which he explains how the tide somehow turned okay, in the 1990s, Soviet Union falls apart and the West starts exporting ideas of liberal democracy, market economy, human rights and good governance from the West towards the East, towards the post-Soviet sphere and Russia. But, it's a tentative, of course, it's not an exact date, but sometime around 2010, 2012, the tide is turning and Russia starts exporting through cyber war and through all kinds of disruptive, and he explains it masterfully, how Russia manages to take hold in Europe and in the United States as well now, arguably bringing, this is not of course only Russia, but there are other factors at work, but the rise of Trump, which can be argued it's another form of oligarchy in the United States. So we do have this some kind of very perverse reversal of information and models of governance and political models, which ended this one-sided movement from the 1990s. I often talk about this book with my friends and my husband, who is a historian. Before reading this book, Road to Unfreedom, I thought our today's zeitgeist, now it's very difficult to sort of make it tangible because we're living in it. So it's like air and we feel something changing, and we thought maybe some historian in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, will look back and will understand what was going on and what was happening. How is it possible that, even we're living in a reality when genocide is happening and wars are happening and the never again, that slogan, the sacred slogan of secular West is breaking down in front of our eyes. We thought somebody would write it in maybe 30 years' time, but this book already exists, and it's Timothy Snyder's book called Road to Unfreedom, which is a masterpiece. So if Russia manages to do this to Western sort of traditional liberal democracies, you can imagine what is Georgia then for Russia to change the climate, change the atmosphere, install its new its models of xenophobic, anti-humanist, anti-enlightenment. We can come up with so many adjectives to describe where Russia is and it's how Russia construes its identity vis-a-vis the West or Europe. So we are right now living in reality, me and my friends, my colleagues, Georgian society, entire Georgia, which 2-3 years ago would have been unthinkable. If someone had told us back then that agents law, the foreign agents law, which we all know it's not really a law, that it's a basic, sort of like a foundation on which dictatorship will be built upon. They are going to use it, like in Russia, selectively to oppress and silence or exile or arrest the critics and free voices. We would all of us, I don't think anybody here was positively inclined towards our current government, the Georgian dream, but still we would say this is not possible. In Georgia, what agents law? This is Russia, xenophobic Russia, not a chance. But we are living in this reality now. So all these wonderful theories and interesting, intricate understandings of power, from Foucault to, even Kafka, our favorite writer, the way he, as we know, the Gregor Samsa really is not turning into an insect. Kafka uses this German word Ungeziefer, which is a vermin, which Kafka is being prophetic in that story also. In 10, 15 years' time, the Nazis will start calling this word, the vermin, Ungeziefer, Jews and other sort of alien elements in their society. So I'm not making direct comparison, of course, that would be vulgar and insensitive, but agents law is the same thing, basically. We are pronounced as foreign bodies inside our own societies. This is not a law. This is not about transparency of who is funding which NGOs or what money is coming to Georgia. This is even posited in ideological terms that these are bringing all kinds of debauchery from the West and LGBT and rights and gay marriage, and we have to preserve our traditions because that's what the people want. Again, we're back to the populism. We are the people, claims our current government, and you who advocate for universal values, human rights, minority rights, I don't know, preservation of Georgian cultural heritage, anything that is being funded, or the sort of international exchange of ideas, projects, collaborations, what we are doing right now, this isn't foreign agent behavior if we take the sort of the logic of this foreign agents law. So this is horrific, really, when you're living through this kind of fascist mode of governance, that you're branded by law as something foreign. Once again, it's much deeper than even law or politics, and in many ways this is a repeat of history, also in a very uncanny way, in a very farcical way as well. Marx was right, saying that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as a farce, because in the 1921, Georgia had several years of, 3 years of independence from the Russian Empire. And at that time, it was really a country of impressive intellectual and political richness and openness and dynamics. We had a progressive social democratic government, not Bolshevik, but social democratic, discussing anything from banking to the questions of ethnic minorities and linguistic diversity. We had conservatives, we had market enthusiasts, the wonderful debates were going on between Georgian intellectuals and statesmen and Western social democrats and Marxists, but that all tragically came to an abrupt end with 1921 and the Bolshevik invasion of Georgia. First Republic was dead. Georgia was incorporated in the Soviet Empire. Most of these thinking heads were either exiled or executed and sent to Gulag, or then the big purges happened in 1937, and Georgia suffered in terms of the per capita as a nation very heavily, because we had those purges were merciless in Georgia, as they were in Russia as well, and most of our artists, writers, thinkers were simply destroyed physically. Now, of course, knock on wood, the executions, it's not happening right now as we speak, but as we speak, we have around 70 political prisoners already. And again, vocabulary is the same. Agent. Mavnebeli, vermin, yes, yeah. Vermin, exactly. So this is a repeat of history. Again, you need somebody with much bigger understanding of how history works and the dialectics, or someone Hegelian, to explain how this is possible. But we, ordinary citizens who try to make better in any way we could our society, we are living a true nightmare on a daily basis. Our close friend, my closest friend and soulmate, the poet that Nino read his on the poetry reading night when we were reading, she read Ziad Radiani's poems. He is in prison now also. This is personal now. We don't know what's going to happen with us and how long this can last. And again, one vicious part of this new xenophobic governance is that it's very selective and it's very random. This law exists because you don't know who will become the victim tomorrow, who they will release, so this, in a way, who they will arrest. This creates even more dread and more fear and terror than knowing that, this is like a blanket law and everybody. So nightmarish existence, really. And I don't want to go on too long. This has many reasons also in Georgia why this happened. It's, of course, for us it seems like we're living a nightmare and hard to wake up from it, but of course nothing happens without reasons. And there was the influence of the church, which became very influential. Georgian nationalism after 1990s became very ethno-mythological, and religion and the church gradually became an inseparable part of the new Georgian nationalist discourse. It wasn't immediately the case in the 1990s, but already in 2000s, church was very influential, and the church is very intimately tied to Russian Orthodox sphere in Georgia. It has much less ties with other Orthodox cultures in Greece and Romania and in other countries. Sadly, we cannot exclude the role of the previous government, Saakashvili's government, this big reformist force that came to power in 2003. So many hopes and aspirations, and country really started changing, and it was the era of optimism, which gradually and then abruptly descended into authoritarianism, into violence, into repressions in the name of the sort of Western civilizing mission somehow, because there were big Westernizers. That also contributed to the discreditation of the West, and that's why now these discourses might be effective when the current government is talking about how the West is debauched and how they want to take away our traditions and, make Georgians change them somehow. But the most important factor, and I will end with this, but if we talk about Georgia, something that we all have to understand is purely political, and it relates to the mode of governance, the way country has been governed and how it's governed right now. We have to remember that Georgia is, of course, a very young country with long legacy of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, nationalism, and such things as divisions of power, checks and balances, institutions were always non-existent. So in Saakashvili's time, when this group of reformers came to the executive branch of the government, they also, logically, they needed to execute these reforms quickly. So back then we were living in the times when Saakashvili and maybe 5-7 of his friends, which had various positions in his government, were deciding everything, from the ways in which today we're marking the 17th anniversary of invasion of Georgia, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. From the how to wage that war to which color to paint a building in central Tbilisi. So it was all concentrated at the top of the vertical. Parliament, judiciary were just there as rubber stamps. And then, of course, Saakashvili's people didn't expect that to happen. But imagine that this kind of structure, absolutely uncontrolled, no accountability, executive function being transferred into the hands of one man, billionaire, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who has vast financial power, $7 billion, more than all Georgian citizens, taken together. So the one man with that much economic power now became sort of a head of this vertical, this very perverse vertical designed for basically one-man rule. And we keep joking that even if you take, Václav Havel and Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and amalgamate them into one big, wonderful leader, even then it's dangerous for one man to hold that much unaccountable political and financial power. And Ivanishvili is very far from any of these big figures or anyone else. He has made his money in Russia. He's a very murky figure. We don't know what his connections are with Russia. We will never know. Georgia is being run and governed from outside constitutional framework. Nowadays, there's big discussion about how the current government is violating our constitution, because we have it in the constitution that Georgia has to move towards Euro-Atlantic integration, and it is true, they are violating the constitution, but the constitution has been non-existent in Georgia because we are being run and governed by some forces. We don't know who. Ivanishvili is one big pillar of this vertical. There are these security services, we call it SUSI, who never been reformed, and we don't know what they are. They're listening to citizens, and they are dealing with, we don't know what their dealings are with the church or with Russia, or we don't know, and we cannot know. So for example, right now, this agent's law, we don't know whose decision it is. Like, who made this decision? Probably Ivanishvili. Ivanishvili has no official power or official position. He cannot be held accountable. He can't even resign because but the other figures, like from even our prime minister, the big difference with Saakashvili times is that back then we knew who was in power. We knew it was Saakashvili and his circle, and they had to be held accountable. Right now, we don't even know that. So if our prime minister tomorrow disappears, no one sees him ever again, we will be even lazy to formally or jokingly ask a question, where is this guy? we will know the decision has been made somewhere else behind the scenes. It's really like a David Lynch movie when this Mulholland Drive, when some cowboy, the southern cowboy, decides how Hollywood will be run from the shadows. He comes and says, you know, this actress should play in this film, and then he disappears again. Everyone is afraid of him. That's basically the model, because I'm a big fan of David Lynch, and that comes to my mind always. But alas, this is not Hollywood, and we're not talking about cowboys and films. We're talking about a country that is being run like that, from shadows, right? Some gangsters or cowboys with very murky connections to the Russian sort of ideological sphere. And one more thing I would add as a side note, though, something that we've been grappling with. For Russia, the developments that are taking place ideologically, the agent's law, the anti-Western sentiments, anti-universalist, anti-humanist, even you could say, you know, big Russia is surrounded by enemies, and we have to. This is logical. If you take, you know, Russia's intellectual history from I don't know, 18th century, even before 19th, and Russia had many different varieties of intellectual thought in which it tried to think of itself as opposed to or as different from the West. Russia had the Slavophiles, it had Pochveniki, the so-called the one subdivision of the Slavophiles, the Eurasianists, of course, Gumilov, and now Dugin and the others who continued that strand. Ivan Ilyin, the Orthodox Christian fascist philosopher who Putin really likes. We didn't. In Georgia, there is no, as I said, our intellectual history, of course, developed within Russian Empire before the Sovietization, was very sort of in dialogue with the Western, or it was much more open. Liberal democracy was taking hold, conservatism was taking hold, social democracy, market, and Niko Nikoladze and all the others. Yeah? Of course, the Soviet Union changed that, and of course, we were living in this isolationist, xenophobic, anti-Western world. But the sort of indigenous or local philosophy, as you know, Georgia, there were some attempts. We had nationalist first president, the Gamsahurdia, Georgia's missions, but nothing really that powerful to base these new xenophobic ideas or paradigms that they are trying to base now. So I don't know how this U-turn and how this xenophobic populist, you know, we speak for the people, we need to protect our people.
They are trying this idea now, Caucasian Georgia, not European, but we are Caucasians.
So they are trying, I agree, but will it work? So that's a big open question. I realize I might have been chaotic a bit, but I think it's important to see Georgia's fight as connected to many other developments and clarity. I think we were talking about this yesterday or the day before. That's the best we can do right now, to just think as clearly as possible what is it that is happening, and maybe think about the ways how this can be resisted. And since we come to the question of resistance, my friends now will tell you what, you know, different forms of